it is. Good evening. Welcome to our first Wednesdays. I've been out of commission for a while. I just got a hip replaced, so I can jump now. Soon I'll be dunking. But anyway, so you'll be seeing me more in the next few months. But tonight it's about polar bears. But before we turn to that, I want to thank our sponsors, Courtyard, the Olsons, and the Osborn Trust. We fly people in from quite a ways far away to have these talks, and we couldn't do it without their support. Now, polar bears, everybody's got to be fascinated with polar bears. Are like, and I'm sure we're going to learn more about this, are like a symbol of the tragedy of climate change. I don't know if you remember, like 20 years ago, World Wildlife Federation had a big series about climate change, and they pictured it was a very iconic image. It's a polar bear on floating ice, forlorn, lonely, like the last polar bear on ice. And it became really a symbol for climate change and biodiversity and impacts on that. And some of you, it even got talked about by Bill Gates. Bill Gates writes an annual letter, and that image had such an impact in Bill Gates' annual letter about climate change, he referred to it. So polar bears are, in addition to being amazing beasts, and I won't say anything about them, I want to save it for our speaker, who is Dr. Karyn Rode. She's a scientist with the USGS, U.S. Geological Services, but it's not just geologists, it's biologists as well. We work with a lot of USGS biologists for a number of our species. We'll have to hope that it sticks around through the administration. But she's been working on polar bears for 20 years and is really going to share what she's learned and some of the impacts of, I'm sure, climate change and the future of polar bears. It's magnificent animals that I hope are around for quite some time. Dr. Rode.
Hi, thank you so much to the Aquarium and the sponsors for having me here tonight. And I want to thank all of you for being here and taking time out of your busy schedules to learn about polar bears. I think it's really cool that we are at an aquarium to talk about polar bears. Because of all the bear species in the world, they're the only one that actually is a marine mammal. So all the rest live their lives out on land, but polar bears actually are living on sea ice that floats over the Arctic Ocean. So I think it's easy to forget, because of all the other bear species are on land, that this is a species that is actually a marine animal. So I think it's really cool that we're here at the aquarium. So I wanted to start your journey tonight talking about polar bears in the same way that I started my journey learning about polar bears. In 2006, I had finished my PhD and a master's degree in zoology, and I'd done a postdoc, and I got a job with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I got the opportunity in that job to go out and do field work on the Arctic sea ice to sedate polar bears with Dr. Steve Amstrup. And Dr. Amstrup was the leader of the USGS Polar Bear Research Program at the time and had been studying polar bears for decades. So for me, it was a huge opportunity to learn from him and to get an opportunity to go in the field. So this picture behind me is one of my first times getting ready to go out onto the Arctic sea ice with Steve there on the left. We had a helicopter pilot, because the only way you can get out to where polar bears are is to take aircraft. We had our mechanic who helps maintain that aircraft in the cold Arctic environment. I was also there with Jeff York, and Jeff and I were rotating out, taking turns on the helicopter, and Jeff had also worked with polar bears for decades. And a wildlife photographer, Dan Cox, to help us to document some of the work that we did, and some of the photos I'll show today are from him. So at this point in my life, I had studied primarily species that lived in temperate and tropical environments. So I'd studied forest elephants and primates in Africa, and I'd studied coastal brown bears. And in those ecosystems, you can see everything that's available to the animals. You can see the food web and the place that they live and how they're finding food resources in those areas. So when I went out on the sea ice, there were a number of things that struck me. And so I wanted you to have the same experience of getting to fly out over the sea ice. So the next slide is a video taken from the helicopter flying over polar bear habitat in one of my first times out. So flying over this environment, and this is actual polar bear habitat, there was two things that occurred to me. One was, how on earth do you find a polar bear out there? It's not a flat pancake. There's a lot of things that look like bears, and people in the helicopters were seeing things that I just could not see. But the second thing that occurred to me was, how on earth is the largest bear species in the world living out here and finding their way around and navigating? It looks desolate. You don't see a lot. You see sea ice. But polar bears have evolved to live out on the sea ice because they have specialized on hunting seals that only haul out on the ice. So they access those seals either where the seals come up to breathing holes or where they'll haul out. The seals will haul out when they have their pups, and they'll also haul out to molt, which is to shed and renew their skin. And so polar bears feed primarily on only one or two seal species, and those species are really fat. And so not only are polar bears really specialized in having a pretty narrow range of prey, but they also eat the highest fat diet of any species in the world. And we've been able to do studies to estimate how much that is, and as much as 80% of the energy that they're consuming is from fat. So imagine if we ate that kind of diet, right? So we would get diabetes, we would get heart disease. So it demonstrates how they are physiologically adapted to this life that they have out on the Arctic sea ice. And we've even offered polar bears in zoos a choice of fat versus muscle, and they also pick 70% of their diet or more as fat. So polar bears are relying on a really productive Arctic marine ecosystem that's underneath the ice. So flying out over the ice, you're not seeing it. But the productivity in that environment, I think we think about cold and you think it's not very productive. But the right-hand video shown here are Pacific walrus from the Chukchi Sea. And there's over 100,000 estimated to live in just one part of the area where polar bears live. And these are 1,000 to 2,000 pound animals that feed on the ocean floor. So the amount of biomass just this one species is getting from the ocean floor, I think it's just a really good demonstration of how incredibly productive Arctic marine ecosystems are. So polar bears are capitalizing on that. They're basically pulling out resources and energy from underneath the ice, and that's what they're relying on. So the amount of Arctic sea ice, varies seasonally with the temperature of the Earth. So on the left-hand side shows March, when the sea ice extent in the Arctic is at its greatest. There's a pink line on these figures that shows where the sea ice extent has typically been historically. On the right-hand side is the time of year when it's the annual sea ice minimum. September is when there's the least sea ice in the Arctic. And you can see that in September, there's a really big difference between the amount of ice that was shown in September of 2020 and the pink lines. And that's showing that there's been substantial amount of sea ice loss, particularly in the summer. So not as much in the spring, but primarily in the summer months. And that it has occurred largely over Alaska. So here's Alaska at the top and Russia. And so the US polar bear populations have experienced some of the highest declines in Arctic summer sea ice. So the figure on the left is just showing over time the extent of Arctic sea ice declining since the 1970s. And on the right is a map showing specifically Alaska. So I'm going to talk tonight about populations that come into the United States. And this map here is showing where the sea ice extent used to be in September in Russia, along Russia and Alaska coasts. And then the green is what it was in 2008, and the yellow is what it's projected to be. So for polar bears that are ranging out on that sea ice habitat, that's a huge area they no longer have to hunt already, and that's continuing to decline. So polar bears have become a natural icon for climate change because their lives are so closely linked to the availability of sea ice. And I think in all of our minds, it's easy to understand that warmer temperatures results in less ice. And that's a real thing for polar bears that are out on the ice trying to navigate that landscape. So they've always had to deal with really significant seasonal changes in the amount of ice, but now they're dealing with a lot of additional decline within a season of the amount of ice that's available for them to hunt. So individual bears are traveling over hundreds and hundreds of miles in order to find food on the sea ice. This map is showing a bear that we collared with a satellite transmitter in the Chukchi Sea. And it shows several years. The dots are her locations over several years. And you can see that just in one direction within a single year, she was going 500 miles. So her round trip is 1,000 miles a year minimum. So they're traveling really massive areas and really remote parts of the Arctic. And their movement patterns are how we've identified specific populations. So there isn't one mixing population of polar bears that's a single population. There are 20 recognized populations, and they're based on those movement patterns like what I just showed you. So individual bears have kind of a fidelity to specific areas, and so there's a lot of different populations that are recognized. 2 of them occur in Alaska. One is in the Chukchi Sea. Those bears range between the US and Russia, just like the bear I just showed you on the last map. And then there's another population that moves between the US and Canada, the southern Beaufort Sea population. In addition to climate change occurring for polar bears, people live and work in polar bear habitat. So in all parts of the Arctic, some bears do come on land. And in some parts of the Arctic, whole populations come on land because the ice is only seasonally available. Off the coast of Alaska, the bears have primarily stayed on the sea ice during the summer months, but some bears do come on shore, and they're interacting with people who live in communities and also people who are working in those areas. And polar bears are also a really important cultural and subsistence resource for indigenous people throughout the world, including Alaska. This map here is showing villages, indigenous communities along the northwest coast of Alaska, where polar bears range in the Chukchi Sea. These are primarily subsistence communities, meaning that they hunt a lot. They primarily hunt. Many of them have a strong culture that's based on whaling, and so they deal with polar bears as a regular part of their lives. So I work for the U.S. Geological Survey, and science is needed to inform management that's outlined in U.S. laws and treaties. So there's 2 U.S. laws that pertain to polar bears. They're listed as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act, but they also are considered a marine mammal and are protected under the U.S. Marine Mammal Protection Act that was established in 1973. So there's been a long-term research program studying polar bears because they've always been protected under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, but now they're also listed as a threatened species. The U.S. is also party to a number of international agreements. We have a treaty with Russia to protect polar bears in the Chukchi Sea. We have a native-to-native agreement in the southern Beaufort Sea, the Inupiat-Inuvialat Agreement. And also the United States is party to an international agreement amongst all the countries that have polar bears to conserve them. So my agency, we are the research branch of the Department of Interior, and our sole job for all of the staff within the U.S. Geological Survey is to provide science. So we don't have any regulatory authority. So my job, I don't make management decisions, I don't suggest policy, I only provide science and information that helps inform decisions. Because we're a science agency, we have a really rigorous review process. We have the most rigorous review process of any agency I'm aware of, even internationally. We have full data transparency. All of our data gets publicly released. So anyone can look at any of the data that is produced by my agency. And we have really significant scientific integrity policies and regular training. So we're really focused on science, and so that's what I'm gonna talk to you about today. So the types of questions that we address in my job are trying to understand how polar bears are responding to sea ice loss, but also considering their potential to adapt. So looking forward, what is the potential that they can adapt to some of this change? but also looking at local specific issues, such as where and when people will encounter polar bears, which is critical for human safety and also for bear safety, and ensuring that harvest is sustainable. So the right to harvest polar bears in the United States is protected for indigenous people. And so we work to provide information to try to ensure that the level of harvest can make sure that polar bears are available in the future. Because polar bears live over these vast remote areas, counting them is hard. Oftentimes what we want to know is how many are there, and is the population declining? But because they're over such huge areas, counting is really difficult. There have been some aerial surveys that have been done for some populations, but not many. Logistics are very challenging, so you have to have aircraft. We work so far offshore that we have to bring fuel with us for those aircraft. This is a fixed wing that was providing fuel that its ski broke on landing. So now we have an aircraft that's 60 miles offshore that has to be brought in off the ice. And then I thought I would give you an example forecast, like when you're sitting there ready to go fly out, it's fog and areas of blowing snow, and you spend weeks. We spend more time waiting than we do actually out on the sea ice. So the logistics of this work is really, really challenging. So with 20 different populations, and what I've just told you about how challenging it is to count them, we really can't tell you what is the trend of the global population. You'd have to have 20 population estimates all at the same time, and you'd have to get them twice to know whether there was a change, whether there was an increase or a decrease. There's only 6 populations that even have a recent estimate, and for those we don't necessarily know trend. So given that, how do we know how polar bears are responding to sea ice loss if we can't count them? Well, we do have a few populations that we have long-term research programs and places that we can estimate how many there are, or if the population is increasing, decreasing, or stable. And we can look at important indicators. So environmental change typically does not have much of an effect on adults, and that's not just for polar bears, but that's for any large mammal. So once a large mammal is an adult age, they're pretty robust to if there's less food in a year, for example. Where environmental change typically does have an effect is on affecting the reproduction and survival of young, and that's definitely true for polar bears, because females are very reliant on having excessive energy resources in order to reproduce. So only pregnant females den. So unlike brown bears and black bears, just the pregnant female polar bears will go into a den. And they do that because they have to have a protected place to have their cubs, because their cubs are really the size of like a soda can when they're born. And so they have to develop in a safety of a den before they can go out on the sea ice with their mom. So this figure on the left here are body mass data of a female that we caught throughout her lifetime in the southern Beaufort Sea. So this is the year that we caught her, and this is her body mass in pounds. All of the lowest points of her body mass during her lifetime were years that she had had cubs. And so between those years, she had to increase her body mass so that she had enough fat and energy when she would go into a den. Because she's not eating in the den, she has to go through a pregnancy and lactate for that cub until they can get back out on the sea ice and she can eat again. So you'll notice that in some years, she doubled her body mass before she was able to have a cub. So huge amount of resources that they need. And her weight, a female's weight when she goes into the den in the autumn, is directly related to the weight of the cubs in her litter. And the weight of a cub, here on the right, is directly related to the chance it will survive. So the condition of a female is a really good indicator of how reproduction and cub survival is going in a particular population. And one of the primary mechanisms by which we think sea ice loss is likely to affect polar bears is that it reduces the amount of area they have to hunt. So they're likely to get less to eat. And so we would expect that females are going to be particularly impacted by that, and we would see changes in reproduction and cub survival. So the 2 populations that occur in Alaska provide a really good opportunity to better understand how sea ice loss is affecting polar bears. They have some interesting ecological differences. So this map here is showing the ocean depth. And the light blue is shallow ocean waters. And the dark blue is where the ocean is really deep. The shallow waters are more productive habitat, and they're where seals tend to like to be. One of the seal species that polar bears eat feeds on the ocean floor, so they really don't want to go out into these deeper water areas. So the polar bears that go in the Chukchi Sea are primarily over shallow habitat, and they have a big area of habitat. But in the southern Beaufort Sea, there's a really narrow shelf, so we wouldn't expect there to be as many polar bears there. So we have very different ecosystems. So to study them, we have to get a helicopter and we have to go out to the sea ice where the bears are. In the Chukchi Sea, oftentimes they're 60 miles offshore. So they're not near the coastline. You have to go out where the bears are. So the trick to finding them is to follow their tracks. So I did figure that out my first time out, that you follow the tracks, which I have to say is a little bit arduous in a helicopter. But then once you can find a bear at the end, so that, everyone's always kind of cheering when you see that picture that you just saw, like, yay, we found it. And then we can sedate a bear and we can get health information and body condition, which is the critical piece of information that can tell us how females are doing in particular. So this picture right here in the middle, I am actually estimating the body fat of that bear. So if you've ever seen a scale that you can stand on and you can find out what your body fat is, it's basically the same technique as estimating fat. The map over here is showing how far out we could go looking for bears. So you only have a certain range with aircraft. So even though polar bears are ranging this huge area, you can't access all of that. So one of the really nice things about using body condition as an indicator of how the population is doing is that you can look at a subset of bears. You don't have to capture all the bears, and you don't have to range for the whole population, as long as you're getting sort of a representative sample. We can also put transmitters to figure out where bears go and take blood samples and hair samples that can tell us things like what bears are eating, whether they've been exposed to pathogens. So there's been some interesting differences between the two populations. So the Chukchi Sea population has shown no decline in body condition and no decline in the number of cubs per female since the 1980s, despite there being substantial sea ice loss. Cubs there and subadults there are heavier, much heavier than they are in the southern Beaufort Sea. So right now it's believed that that's a stable population. We don't have multiple population estimates there, but the indicators suggest that population is likely stable. The picture there at the bottom is a mom with 3 yearlings, and they're very healthy. That's a sign of a really good mom and also a pretty healthy system, because typically bears will have 2 cubs, often a third one, if it's born, doesn't survive. In contrast, in the southern Beaufort Sea, there's been declines in body condition and cub survival that have led to a substantial population decline, from 1,600 to 900 bears in just a very short period. So why is that? We would definitely expect there to be fewer bears in the southern Beaufort Sea because there's not as much habitat, but something's changed that has resulted in a decline there that hasn't affected bears in the Chukchi Sea, even though they're neighboring populations. So with blood samples, we're able to determine whether or not a bear has fed in the past 7 to 10 days. And on this map behind me, the green dots are bears that haven't fed in 7 to 10 days, which is a pretty long time to go between catching a seal. The red dots are bears that have fed recently. And so you can see that in the Chukchi Sea, there's a lot more red, and in the Beaufort Sea, there's a lot more green. And so 4 times as many females in the southern Beaufort Sea had not fed in the springtime compared to bears in the Chukchi Sea. The springtime is a really important feeding time for polar bears, particularly for females, because they've come out of their den. That's when they need to be gaining weight, right? Because they've lost a lot of weight. And these bears are not eating. And a study by my colleague Anthony Pagano was able to follow a small group of females and put out video camera collars to determine whether or not they'd been feeding. And females that hadn't fed lost 10% of their body mass. So they're losing body mass at a time when they really need to be gaining. We did another study that found that when females in the southern Beaufort Sea ate less fat and they ate less ring seal, which is their primary prey, that they had lower cub survival. So between these multiple studies, we could show a direct link between their eating less of their primary prey, and that's leading to population decline. So you kind of connect all the dots from have they been eating, what's the female's condition, was there lower cub survival, and then a population decline. So polar bears in the southern Beaufort Sea have kind of had a double whammy. So they lost sea ice, but they also have had years of poor seal productivity, and specifically ring seals, which are their primary prey. And that hasn't been the case in the Chukchi Sea. The seal populations have been stable. So there are differences in these two populations. They've both seen a lot of sea ice loss, but one has also resulted in effects on the seal population, whereas the other so far has maintained stable seal population. So bears in the Chukchi Sea, we think, have been doing well so far, but sea ice loss is continuing in both areas. And I showed you in the beginning that most of the sea ice loss had been in the summertime, but now there's been unprecedented declines during the springtime, which is an important feeding period for polar bears. So these maps are off the northwest coast of Alaska and the study area of the Chukchi Sea that I've worked since 2008. And this is typically what it would look like when we would go do our work and capture polar bears and collect data. And this is what it was starting to look like in 2017. And we have not been able to do the same work to go out and sedate bears and get our data since 2017 because the sea ice conditions have been so poor. In addition to that, the changes that have occurred in summer sea ice have also affected bear behavior in both of the populations. So these figures are showing time on the x-axis and the percent of bears that summer on land. So they're coming on land in the summertime. And that's been increasing over time, and it's projected to continue to increase if we just kind of take this relationship and put it forward, if it continues on that same pattern. So more bears are coming on land, and they're also staying there longer. So in both populations, the bears that come on land are spending almost 2 months on land in the summer. So 2 months when they're not feeding on their primary prey. We know from other parts of the Arctic that longer time on land can result in poor body condition because the food resources on land are not very good. The population in western Hudson Bay and eastern Canada loses all of its sea ice in the summertime. So the entire population comes on land, and that's always been that way. But now those bears are spending more time on land, and we know there that that has resulted in a decline in body condition and a decline in the population. Bears spending more time on land also means that they're interacting more with people, so there's increased potential for human-bear conflict. On the sea ice, polar bears are consuming fat, and fat has twice the calories of carbohydrates and protein. So on shore, polar bears have been observed feeding on a variety of things, birds and kelp. They're very opportunistic, sometimes caribou and fish. But those food resources are not fat. But there's been a lot of question about whether or not polar bears can adapt to spending more time on land. Grizzly bears live on land, but Arctic coastal environments are not very productive habitat. But to answer this question, we went to western Hudson Bay and did a very focused study tracking the food intake, energy expenditure, and weight change of 20 bears while they summered on land in western Hudson Bay. We were fortunate to have the opportunity to put out video camera collars that recorded what the bears were doing. So we knew exactly what they were eating and how much they were eating. We used some interesting methods here. We're collecting breath. Breath can tell you about what kind of macronutrients the bears are using to fuel their energy. And we were able to use some methods that have been used in humans, which allow a measurement of energy expenditure, so how many calories they're using each day. So the bears exhibited a wide variety of strategies. There were, I'll go back actually. On the previous slide, if I can go back. Let me see, hold on. It's showing differently on my screen. Oh, here we go, okay. So on this map, this is showing the locations of the bears in that study. Down here, there are several bears that don't really have any lines connected to their dots, and they stayed in one spot the entire time when they were on land. Other bears were inland, and they were feeding on berries and looking for food there. And then some bears made these really long distance movements, swimming out even into Hudson Bay. So this shows a video of a bear that sat on the coastline. So pretty much watched the sunrise and the sunset over Hudson Bay waiting for the ice to return and did nothing else. We found him in the exact same spot we originally caught him in. Some bears were able to find birds and fed on birds up here. This is a bear that swam out to Hudson Bay, and one bear that swam out into Hudson Bay even found a seal. And then other bears were feeding on berries. So you can see the chin of this bear that's feeding on berries. But even though there was such a wide range in behavior, 19 of those 20 bears lost weight, and they lost a pound a day, regardless of what their strategy was. So it suggests that bears really don't have an opportunity to adapt in those coastal Arctic environments. The foods that are available to them, are no match for the high-fat seals that they're getting out on the sea ice. Let's see. And so how long bears spend on land is directly related to the amount of sea ice available. So the more ice-free days there are, the longer they spend on land. And the number of ice-free days continues to increase. So this figure here is showing over time. The black is what has occurred so far. This is for the Beaufort Sea, the amount of open water. And these are projections from global climate models that project how much sea ice there may be in the future. And based on that, we are able to estimate how land use may change over time. So currently, about 30 to 40% of bears in the two US populations come on land, and by 2040, we estimate that to be somewhere between 50 and 80%. The number of days they spend on shore is going to increase by almost a month, and so that's just based on the changes in the sea ice conditions. But how this plays out does depend on emission scenarios. So these two lines here are showing two different emission scenarios and how that affects the amount of sea ice that's available to polar bears. And so this is an unmitigated or a mitigated scenario. And that's a pretty big difference. This is a very meaningful difference for polar bears in terms of the amount of time that they spend on land. There's clearly a lot of innovation that is occurring, and that has occurred just in my short career, trying to find ways to help address climate change. And people are really, really interested in polar bears. I mean, I'm so glad that all of you are here tonight. And I'm amazed when I travel and when I'm out places. This is in Hamburg, Germany. I was working at the zoo there, and they had a cub born. And when I was leaving the airport, I went in to get a snack at this newsstand or what have you, and the whole city is just so excited about this bear cub being born. This middle photo is at Point Defiant Zoo this past summer. We were doing some research with their bears, and you can't see real well, but there's about 30 people packed in to see this bear, in its pool during the summertime. And these are school children in an Alaska Native village in Kivalina, Alaska. They have polar bears in their backyard, but they're still really interested in what else we're learning. So people are really fascinated with this species, and that interest really has, I think, helped fuel change. And over my short career also, we've seen a huge growth in the partnerships that are dedicated to conserving polar bears. We work closely with oil and gas. There's development and activity on the North Slope of Alaska, and they are very committed to mitigating any negative effects on polar bears. Indigenous communities and leaders have always advocated for bears, and they work closely with us. Some of them go out in our helicopters with us during our research, and we work really closely together. Zoos have really come to the table during my career to provide a resource that helps us have a much better understanding about polar bears in the wild. A lot of the research I talked about tonight, we wouldn't have been able to answer these questions without doing some work in zoos that helped us develop new methods. This is at the Alaska Zoo. There was so many people from so many different backgrounds there to try to learn as much as they could while they were sedating the bear there. And for my part and my agency's part, and I can speak for other federal agencies that are involved in polar bear work, we continue to do everything we can to learn more about this species. And we're learning new things all the time that helps in supporting them into the future. The video on the right is from a camera collar of one of those bears that was in western Hudson Bay. It was an adult male. And I have to say I was really amazed by the behavior of this bear because he's with 2 other adult males, just kind of hanging out, waiting for the ice to return. Male brown bears, they just beat each other up, so that these were just kind of hanging out casually together. It was super interesting. This past year, we went out to the Chukchi Sea for the first time since 2017, and that I showed you the map of how the ice has melted, and it's made our work really hard to do. And we still are struggling to be able to collect the kind of data we need to collect in that area, but this was a very encouraging family group. This is a mom and 2 2-year-olds, and the 2-year-olds are typically the same size as the mom, but these are some chunky looking 2-year-olds. I think they got enough to eat, so it was great to see them out on the ice. So thank you so much for being here. If you want to learn more, a really great resource is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's Polar Bear Specialist Group. I'm a member. They've just redone their website. There's lots of great information there. And also my USGS Polar Bear Research Group has a website as well. So thank you so much.
Wildlife conflict, so there's more of them get shot. I say that because of wolves. Second thing is, what about hybridization with brown bears, with the grizzly bears? And what are the prospects of that? Will the genes get in? Third one is, do they get new diseases?
Great questions. Okay, yeah, great question. So yes, there is evidence that there's more conflict with bears spending more time on shore. I mean, partly they're just there more, and so now they're in human habitat more than they have been in the past. There's also another issue with that is that the longer the bears are on shore, they're losing more weight, and as they become more nutritionally stressed, then they can be attracted to areas of human food and areas that humans are. So there have been studies that have connected those dots that we would expect more conflict with bears spending more time on shore. There have been hybridization events between polar bears and grizzly bears. I think it made it 2 generations, and then not past that. So I don't think, so it can happen. It's not a big concern currently that polar bears are gonna be significantly hybridized with grizzly bears, or that's really going to help them much, because, so we have a study that's getting ready to come out now looking at Arctic grizzly bears, because we were curious, how are Arctic grizzly bears doing it? And Arctic grizzly bears are the smallest of the brown bears. So brown bears and grizzly bears are the same species. And grizzly bears that occur in the Arctic coast environments are the smallest of any of the grizzly bears in the world, and they occur at the lowest densities. So those food resources are not very good. And we just recently did a study that showed that those bears are kind of barely getting by. So even in a hybridization event, they would have to get a lot smaller. So a Arctic grizzly bear is about a fourth of the size of a polar bear right now. So there's a big size difference. And then the last question about, are they getting exposed to more diseases? Yes, we just actually published a study showing that there have been increases in the Chukchi Sea in the proportion of bears that are being exposed to different pathogens, some of which are terrestrially based, so they're getting them by spending more time on land. And there was a study done in the southern Beaufort Sea as well, showing that bears that use land were exposed more to some of those pathogens that occur primarily in terrestrial environments. Yeah.
Other questions? I'm sorry to take up so much time.
Hi there. Over here. I have a question about the reproductive cycle, and like that last picture that you were showing with the mama and they were 2-year-olds. What is the average reproductive cycle, and how long does it take until the babies go their own way and start their own thing? And have you seen extensions and longer time between reproduction cycles because of this events happening?
Yeah, great question. So females, well, they are delayed implanters. So when they go into a den. They're actually not technically pregnant yet, so they have a very short gestation, which is just from like October to December. The cubs are born probably around sometime in early January. They come out of the den around March. They stay with their mom that first year, and then the second year they're called yearlings, and then that third year when they're 2-year-olds, that was in the spring, and she's probably going to wean them any day now. So once they're kind of her size, and also the springtime is mating season, and so often that's what also encourages the cubs to be weaned, is during that time. There is a little bit of variation in that. In Western Hudson Bay, they do see a number of females that only keep their cubs through the yearlings. They don't tend to keep them until they're 2-year-old. And so that would really be a place that would be interesting to know whether or not they're keeping their cubs longer than they have in the past, because we know that population has been stressed by sea ice loss, but we don't have any data on that. But yeah, great question.
Hi, I'm over on your right,
Oh, yep.
up here, near the top.
Okay.
Anyway,
Oh, thank you.
now over here.
It's really hazy out here.
Yeah,
So I can't see
I get
very
it.
well.
Thank you, Dr. Rowe, for a really interesting presentation. If I understand you correctly, it seems like the polar bears are kind of the canary in the coal mine, in that they, being at the top of the food chain, are kind of the manifestation, if you will, of climate change and the loss of polar ice, and what's happening at the bottom of the food chain that's then not supporting them them being at the top of the food chain. So first question is that, am I hearing you correctly? And second question would be, for those of us here in the audience, what can we do, and how can we sort of where we are affect their health and really, I guess, affect the health of their ecosystem, so to support their, if they truly are the canary in the coal mine, support that whole ecosystem, which would then sort of suggest that that's supporting, the environment of the earth as a whole. That makes sense?
Yeah, so we do view polar bears as ecological indicators in a number of ways. And in fact, I published a paper in a journal, Ecological Indicators. And they are an indicator of the health of the ecosystem below them, because they are high on the food chain. So if something happens with Arctic cod, for example, that then affects the seals, then that's going to show in polar bears. So like, it is an indicator that something's changed in the ecosystem in the Beaufort Sea, because the seal populations have shown some poor years, and that had an effect on the polar bears. So the polar bears were the first signal that something was going on there, and since then they've found declines in body condition of a number of other species that were all linked to Arctic cod. So that was like a red flag that something had changed with Arctic cod in that ecosystem. Also, pathogens and contaminants move up the food chain. And so in our recent pathogens study, looking at pathogens that cause disease, we found that what prey species they consumed affected what pathogens polar bears were exposed to. So they're also an indicator of what pathogens are in the system. So yes, I think they are an ecological indicator in a number of ways, and what people can do about that, the focus is certainly that we can have an impact on how sea ice loss plays out. The models I showed you are one of many that have been done that have shown, the link of, emissions to sea ice, and that's really the primary way to protect polar bears. And then also protecting their habitat when they're on shore, for example, that they have adequate places to rest. There's a lot of, work that's being done to mitigate, but I think for people who don't live in the Arctic, I think, focusing on what you can do to, in your own life to affect warming is the primary way.
Okay, over here, on your left, top left. You sort of spoke about this a little bit, and I was late, so apologies if you already went over this, but talking about the cod and with sea currents changing, so are you seeing then that then the seals are then kind of ending up in other places, and the cod, like you said, are they ending up in other places because the currents, the ocean currents themselves are moving? And then my other question had to do with pathogens. You talked about pathogens, but also, is it possible that there might be some very ancient pathogens frozen in the ice that when it melts, they're going to be like these new pathogens in this environment?
Yeah.
Some that were frozen in time.
Yeah, good questions. So the first one about the currents, I wish we had that level of detail of what's going on in the Arctic. I mean, for seals, we don't know. We had some indicators, in the southern Beaufort Sea that the population had declined, but we know so little about what's happening with ring seals and bearded seals. There have been some studies that have tagged some, but they show really a lot of individual variation, so it's really hard to determine kind of patterns. And then we know even less about Arctic cod. So there's a lot of work being done, but how that might be changing with currents, even understanding how the currents are changing. A lot of the work is done in the summertime because that's when you can get a vessel out. So when there's sea ice, there's not a lot of data being collected. I mean, when we're out with our aircraft, there's nobody else out there. So it really is a forefront of discovery. There's a lot we don't know, so we don't have answers to most of the questions about the currents. Let's see, your second question was about, pathogens in the ice. That, I will not, I'm not a disease expert. I did some work with pathogens with polar bears. I have heard of incidents of that, but not heard anything related to polar bears specifically. So I don't have a sense for, the potential of that. I haven't heard a lot of discussion about that, but I'm not
I
well
asked
informed.
because I had read about, in Russia, some new pathogens because of the ice melting. And then the currents, I had read about a penguin that washed up on the shore of Australia because the current had shifted and somehow a penguin ended up, it was an emperor penguin that ended up on the shore of Australia. So that was shocking.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of marine mammal strandings and marine mammals that show up in odd places. I haven't heard as much about some of their prey species, but it's possible that that's occurred. It's just not well documented.
Hello there, thank you. In regards to polar bear decline and the geological and science side of it, is there any relation, is there an issue or problem with poachers in these areas as well that contributes to the decline, or is that not an issue for the Arctic area?
Well, there's legal harvest throughout much of Canada and then also in the United States. So it's not, the harvest that's occurring isn't poaching, and it's well regulated in those places. With close management, I mean, hunters are collecting all sorts of samples and information, and they're really involved in managing the polar bear populations. So poaching isn't as much of an issue. There's no harvest in Norway. Greenland also has native harvest, but also well managed. So it hasn't been a concern that there is illegal harvest. Certainly, we do a lot of work trying to estimate what level of legal harvest is sustainable. And so that's a big part of some of these international agreements and native-to-native agreements is trying to determine what is sustainable. But for example, in the United States, the harvest level has been well below what we think is sustainable. So they're not harvesting anywhere near what we would be concerned. So I think that leads to one question that often comes up, which is that, okay, you have sea ice loss causing a population decline, but then you're harvesting. It's not always additive. So it's sort of complex that if you're hunting, sometimes you're taking out sort of the weaker animals in the population, and you also kind of reduce competition. So it's not always additive that when there's harvest, if a population is declining, that it's also going to lead to more decline.
So these bears are really high on the trophic structure. So I'm wondering, you might expect for more persistent environmental pollutants to biomagnify and bioaccumulate in their tissues, things like mercury, PFAS, micro and macroplastics. Is that something that you're seeing, and are you seeing any impact of those toxins on the bear health?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of research on we kind of just call them all contaminants, all the things that you were talking about. There's a lot of different ones. And so we're seeing the patterns of regulation. So things that have been regulated in the environment, we've seen declines. But then we're seeing some new things show up, like flame retardants, for example, are showing up more. And it varies based on the circulation patterns, which population gets most, shows the highest levels. So for example, like Greenland has seen pretty high levels, and that's partly because of the circulation patterns of where those end up. It's really difficult to know what the impacts are on the bears because they're probably sublethal, meaning that they could affect their immune system and various aspects of their physiology. It's not causing mortality. So there have been some indications that they can have reproductive effects or immune effects, but nothing dramatic, nothing that's been linked to like a population decline.
Hi.
Hi.
Did I get it up? Okay. I'm also interested in your perspective on polar bear tourism. I see that's advertised more and more, and just kind of interested as to what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, there's been a lot of interest in doing work to understand if there's impacts of tourism. It occurs in a lot of different scenarios. So like in Svalbard, it's really ship-based. In Western Hudson Bay, it's via tundra buggies, and what the bears are doing at that time. At the time that tourism occurs really varies. So I think we haven't been able to do a lot of research on that, but like for example, in Western Hudson Bay, I mean, those bears are on shore. They don't have to be near where the tundra buggies are. They're mostly resting then, so they have a choice to leave the area. So as long as it's not imposed in ways where the bears don't have a choice to be somewhere else. And I did a lot of work during my PhD, was all focused actually on brown bears and tourism and trying to figure out the best way to have tourism and where bears are fishing and things like that. So we don't have a lot of good information. Like I know in Svalbard, they've been trying to figure out like what is the appropriate viewing distance and things like that. So I know there's a lot of effort, but I guess I would just summarize by saying, yes, there's some things we don't know, but in the big scheme of things, it's so minor compared to the dramatic effects of sea ice loss and potential changes in their prey. I mean, that's really that's what's driving population declines. Yeah.
So just two closing remarks. One is I want to give an advertisement for federal science. I've been a research biologist for maybe 10, 15 universities, for nonprofit conservation organizations, for NOAA, obviously here. I can't even remember all the different research jobs I had. But these types of studies that USGS does and that NOAA does, long-term, deep and consistent studies of organisms, it's special. And it's really, some of our best biologists in the world are in USGS and NOAA. So I want to give an applause for federal science. I mean, all those years of data are hard to come by. And so now we adjourn, we go out, you have drinks, you have more conversation, make your own crafts and Christmas decorations. I want to mention the next first Wednesday is not the first Wednesday, because that is New Year's Day. The next first Wednesday is January 8th. But I would hope to see all you here. I would hope this is filled. One of my passions is wolves. That's why I asked the question about conflict. Wolves are back in California. And we have an incredible panel of wolf biologists and investigative journalists and LA Reporter to talk about what is the future as wolves enter California. So I hope to see you here for that, January 8th, and let's have good conversation. Go outside.